What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is the best armies in Warhammer 40k. A very special edition because we just saw the new Dataslate update hit the game like a meteor thrown by the very gods themselves. This one changed a ton of factions, updated a lot of the underperforming factions in the game, and hit some of the top performing factions of the game, theoretically bringing their power level down. We're just beginning to see the results of this data slate come in, but if you want a summary of all of the changes made and some of the biggest changes, at least in my opinion, you can watch my videos over the last couple of days. I will link those down in the video description. Now, normally in this video series, we talk about undefeated lists for larger events over the last weekend. We're not going to be doing quite that today because not every event used the new data slate. It was also kind of a quiet weekend for competitive 40k. A lot of GTs and larger sized tournaments failed to fire this weekend, probably because of the impending balance change, totally changing the rules of the game and making a lot of the results already outdated. So we're going to be talking about the two events this weekend that I could find that used the updated data slate. We'll talk about the top three in both of these tournaments. The first one we'll talk about is the Twisted GT. This was only a 22-player event held in the UK, I believe by the folks over at the Twisted Dice YouTube channel. This one was won by Chaos Space Marines, where Chaos Space Marines saw a little bit of a mild nerf in the new update. While they didn't get hit quite as hard as some of the other factions due to the core rules changes, like the changes to towering and to devastating wounds, obviously their combination with the Forge Fiend giving itself devastating wounds and hazardous does mean it's less effective against high model count infantry. That said, there are a lot of other tools within the Chaos Space Marine faction to deal with units like that, and the Forge Fiend is just as good at pumping mortal wounds into heavy targets or now unsavable damage thanks to that devastating wounds characteristic into high defense targets. Now, they did see some points changes to their most powerful shooting units and some of their support characters, so they are overall a little bit nerfed, but clearly not enough to stop this list from going undefeated. This list was led by Abaddon the Despoiler and also ran a Chaos Lord with the Mark of Khorne. We also had a Tzeentch Dark Commune as well as a Nurgle Dark Commune. A Cultist mob to objective secure some objectives away. 2 units of Accursed Cultists to take in those Dark Communes, alongside a unit of Chosen with the Mark of Khorne to house the Chaos Lord. These guys have a natural ability to advance in charge, making them very maneuverable, and with the Chaos Lord still granting access to free battle tactic stratagems, allowing Infernal Rites or Profane Zeal to be used on the unit for free, still retains some usefulness. Not quite as effective pre-nerf when you could potentially be affecting that unit with other stratagems. We still have the most powerful stratagems within this Chaos Space Marine Codex, usable by that Chaos Lord's Rites of Battle-esque effect. We then also had 2 Forge Fiends as well, one of them running the Mark of Chaos Undivided to give it access to that full reroll stratagem to try to fish for those devastating wounds. The other one with Mark of Nurgle to then use that reactive lone operative stratagem. Clearly the points increase is not quite enough to stop Forge Fiends from seeing play. These guys do ridiculous damage with their guns, especially when rerolls are applied to them, and so I'm really not surprised to see them even at the high cost of 180 points. Maybe triple Forge Fiends isn't quite included in a lot of lists right now, but 1 or 2 definitely feels like they fit. We also had a unit of Obliterators to add more indirect fire support, alongside 2 units of Nurglings from an allied demonic manifestation to help complete secondaries by deep striking in, and the Blue Scribe. A lot of times we would have seen the Changeling in this slot, but with a massive points increase to that unit, the Blue Scribes I think will take their place. These guys are hard to kill, have lots of wounds, can do mortal wounds in the movement phase, and are a fast-moving lone operative, which is exactly what you want for 65 points to either start on the table, move up aggressively to do center board objectives on the first turn, or just deep strike in your opponent's deployment zone and get yourself some behind enemy lines or some investigate signals. It's also interesting to see Abaddon taken by himself. He is targetable by Dark Obscuration, so he is difficult to kill as a single entity, and he has enough wounds, high enough toughness, and decent enough saves that oftentimes enemy shooting can't knock him out. Sometimes you'd see a couple of Terminators to house that guy, but it doesn't look like it was necessary, as this was obviously went undefeated. Moving on from that, the number 2 and number 3, all the X and 1 players at this event, all took Necrons. But interestingly, they did take slightly different versions of Necrons. While Necrons didn't see too many buffs in the new data slate, they probably benefited the most from not having that many nerfs. While some of their most powerful units like Doomsday Arcs and Lichguard did go up pretty significantly in points, a lot of their characters and other more niche units went down, so it was generally speaking kind of a side grade. However, a lot of the predators in the metagame that could deal with Necrons have been nerfed themselves. So Necrons I think are poised to do fairly well in this upcoming season, and we are seeing that represented here. The first list we'll talk about in second place was Steve Scott. Scott. This list was running a Chronomancer alongside a Hexmark Destroyer with the Sovereign Coronal to give an aura of +1 to hit thanks to units counting as being led by leader characters. We had an Lord with the Hypermaterial Ablator to make his joined unit harder to kill with stealth and potential cover. Nemesaur Zandrak to use an Agent's Effect effect on an enemy stratagem. Orican the Diviner to grant a 4+ invulnerable save to the unit he joins, as well as a second Overlord with the Resurrection Orb and a Technomancer. This list was so focused on powering huge bricks that it saw not only 2 units of Lich Guard, 10 Lich Guard apiece in those units, but also a 20 model Warrior Squad. That big Necron Warrior unit can have Orican the Diviner locked into it to give it a 4+ invulnerable save to all of the models in that unit, which the 2 Lich Guard with Hyperphase Swords and Dispersion Shields already have baked in. We can then support those with the Overlords to be constantly resurrecting models and present a wide variety of threats. Those warriors are relatively lightly armored but extremely numerous, whereas the Lich Guard are much harder to punch through, but there are less of them, meaning that your opponent has to have a wide variety of attack profiles to be able to deal with a horde like this. Kind of a classic Necron Silver Tide, and we also see it supported by 2 units of Crypto Thralls, 2 individual Doomsday Arcs to benefit from that Sovereign Coronal, alongside a unit of Flayed Ones for some forward deploy, and some Scarab Swarms, as well as a Canoptic Reanimator for support. Now in third place, we also saw a little bit more of a shooting-heavy variety in Ben Piddington's Necron list. This one, in fact, eschews the Sovereign Coronal, not choosing to equip that enhancement at all. It does have a Hexmark Destroyer, but he is unenhanced. We do have 2 Lords, however, both of them with Resurrection Orbs, Orican the Diviner for, again, that 4+ invulnerable save, 1 Technomancer with the Veil of Darkness, and the Transcendent Catan. Interesting, we didn't see that Transcendent Catan in the second place list. Despite how powerful that unit is, it did go up in points, and it seems like it unlocked a ton of range support for that list. This one is choosing to keep the utility of that Catan to jump around the table, be extremely difficult to kill, basically just be able to dominate both primary and secondary objectives if your opponent can't respond to it. We then had 1 unit of 20 Necron Warriors with Gauss Reapers and a second unit with Flayers, which has a reactive reanimation effect on either one of those warrior units, plus 1 unit of Crypto Thralls, a Canoptic Reanimator to support them, 1 single Doomsday Arc, and a bunch of Destroyers, 1 standard Locust Destroyer, and 3 Locust Heavy Destroyers with Gauss Destructors, their large 6 damage anti-tank weapon. We also had a unit of 10 Lich Guard. These guys were rocking War Sides, and it's likely that we had Orican the Diviner attached to this unit to grant it its 4+ invulnerable save. With Orican in that unit, we can then put the Technomancer in the Warrior Squad to give it a Feel No Pain alongside all of those reanimations from the nearby Ghost Arc. Last but certainly not least in the list, we had 1 unit of Tomb Blades filling up the back to complete some secondary objectives. This list as well did pretty well, bringing Ben to a 4-1 record, putting Necrons as the 2 and 3 spots in the event. That brought us on to our next event, the Munsterland GT, a 33-player GT in Germany. And this one saw the return of the ancient meta menace, Aeldari, were overrepresented in this particular event. The event was won by Thomas Butelman, who took what I think is going to be a pretty popular list for Eldar players moving on into the new season. This list focused on the infantry units that weren't quite hit by the nerf. We did see some points increases and obviously mechanical changes to devastating wounds, but those are not keeping units like Wraithguard down, since the Phantasm stratagem is still able to affect them. So taking large bricks of units that you can focus your buffs from Farseers on and your Fate Dice and your Phantasm to keep alive and kicking into the late game makes these units incredibly difficult for opponents to deal with. The list was running an Autarch Wayleaper with the Phoenix Gem to respawn him if he died, Illic Nightspear, as well as a Spirit Seer with Fate's Messenger and the Incarn. That new 350-point Incarn does put a huge tax on new Eldar armies, but its ability to charge after teleporting to the position of a destroyed enemy certainly makes it worthy of the inclusion. We had 3 Fire Prisms, even playable at their new 180-point cost, as well as 2 Night Spinners, who got out of the Dataslate with only a minor points increase to add a little bit of indirect fire and anti-infantry shooting. The rest of the list was pretty light, with only a unit of Warp Spiders, as well as a Wraithguard unit with an attached Spirit Seer. The Spirit Seer was upgraded with Fate's Messenger to turn some of their attacks into 6s, either hit or wound roll or saving throw, potentially allowing them to trigger devastating wounds without the use of additional Fate Dice. Decision to include Illic Nightspear without any additional Rangers in the list is a really interesting one. He is an infiltrating stealth lone operative, so he is a fairly useful unit to include, generally speaking, but he is also very multiplicative of the damage of a Ranger squad, especially since they have potentially multiple abilities to reactively move, both moving when enemies get within 9 inches of them and using Phantasm to escape. He's also a solid outlet for Fate Dice, having a devastating wound gun gun himself, allowing him to bypass saves on heavy infantry like 3-wound enemies that he can one-shot with his 3-damage gun. The list is very light on the ground, comprised of not that many units, but is still able to take a total of 5 tanks, the Incarn, and that big Wraithguard brick, who both cost a lot of points and represent a ton of power on the tabletop. Definitely we are seeing the impact of these points changes, with the list not able to fit as many utility units like Shadow Specters and Warp Spiders as it could in the previous version, but still very effective. Moving on, we will jump now to 3rd place, where we talk about Matthias Bellman, who also took Aeldari, a little bit of a similar composition, but with some minor changes. This one was also running an Autarch Wayleaper, as well as Illic Nightspear and the Incarn. Basically a very similar composition of characters. That Illic Nightspear was alone again, just that 70-point lone operative, proving worth it alongside the other now points increased Eldar units. The list was running 3 Fire Prisms and 2 Night Spinners just like the other one, but instead of playing the large brick of Wraithguard, chose to take those points up with multiple Warwalkers and Warp Spider units, with 3 Warwalkers, each rocking 2 Bright Lances and 2 units of Warp Spiders. The Warp Spiders add some very necessary anti-infantry punch to the composition. One thing that those Wraithguard no longer do is punch through large units, because they are only 1 shot apiece, and Devastating Wounds being unable to split means that they will only ever kill 1 model. The Warp Spiders add a ton of Devastating Wounds torrents that have the opportunity to knock out low toughness enemies, or even punch some wounds into higher toughness enemies like heavily armored infantry. Now, for a little bit of variety, let's jump into the 2nd place finisher at the Munsterland GT. This was Arthur Gutler, who was playing Tau Empire. As I mentioned in my video on Saturday, Tau Empire were the recipient of enormous points decreases that, while not changing their faction mechanically, did make them ludicrously more efficient and able to trade with more mechanically powerful armies on a 1-to-1 basis. And we are seeing that here, with Artur moving from a classic battlesuit-oriented Tau build to what is ostensibly a Tau parking lot. This list was rocking Aun Va for his supreme survivability and low points cost, 3 Cadre Fireblades, one of them rocking 3 Unity Devastation to buff the units that his unit is guiding, alongside a Cold Star Commander with Exemplar of the Kauyon to buff a large Crisis team. With 3 units of Breachers, these guys now with a significantly reduced points cost, able to act as pretty effective traders, especially when generating additional attacks from attached Cadre Fireblades. We had a single Devilfish to transport one of those Breacher teams around, potentially acting as a little bit of a springboard, dropping Breacher teams off to push to the middle of the table, and then embarking other Breacher teams to move around the table for later on in the game. That is all backed up by 3 Hammerhead gunships, alongside 3 Piranhas and 2 sets of 2 Tetras. In the list as well, with 2 units of Crude Carnivores, 2 units of Crude Hounds, and a unit of Vespid Stingwings. Alongside massive numbers of light vehicles and light infantry, this list is extremely good at taking midboard objectives and scoring secondary objectives, and backs it up with some ridiculous long-range firepower from those newly extremely cheap Hammerhead gunships, plus the classically powerful Crisis Battlesuit team that also still saw a pretty significant points decrease. 40 points in total between the Crisis team and its commander, if I remember correctly. Huge efficiency out of the Tau Codex now allowed Artur to do well in this tournament, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Tau making it to these podium finishes more often in the future. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. I am so psyched to see what we get next week as the new metagame starts to catch on to more tournaments and larger events. One thing to take away from this is that, well, Eldar was very dominant, especially in the Munsterland GT. That's largely going to be the case for a little while, as especially competitive players who are practiced with Eldar continue to use them. While I do think Eldar are still one of the strongest factions in the game even after all of their nerfs, they are definitely not as easy to play as they once were. And I think you're going to see their success be restricted to more and more experienced players, whereas the newer players who are just running Wraith Knights and seeing success with them based on their mechanical efficiency are going to fall off a little bit more often. That said, we are already seeing some of the new faction heavyweights do well, including those Necrons and Tau. Chaos Space Marines is also interesting to see at the top there. They did get a little bit of a debuff, as I mentioned before, but that probably wasn't enough to drop them significantly from their incredibly strong position at the end of the previous season. And with that, that's going to be all for me today. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these lists and the changes to the metagame with the Dataslate update. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.